Now, you might ask why Russia didn't defend its interest in Crimea and insist on keeping Crimea during the breakup of the Soviet Union. But of course, the way that happened was rather peculiar. Once the breakup took place, Gorbachev was no longer in charge. Yeltsin was the one that, the president of Russia, was the one that made the agreements with the other members of the other ex-Soviet states. And Yeltsin really did have other things on his mind. First of all, he had to disentangle the military and naval installations and so on between Russia and Russia and Ukraine. And one of the results of this was the leasing of the port of Sevastopol, Russia's greatest naval base, which they'd had for 200 years. The leasing of that by Ukraine to Russia was part of the settlement in which they disentangled their various military forces. But Yeltsin had other things on his mind. The crisis Russia was facing economically as it changed systems, the financial crisis it was soon plunged into. All of this meant that the aspirations of the Crimean people to remain part of Russia was not really very high on the agenda. And of course, it was inconceivable to any Russian leader that Ukraine would ever be anything except a close friend and ally. And the idea that Ukraine might one day be subverted to join an alliance hostile to Russia was something they couldn't even conceive of. So the arrangement made was that Sevastopol, the greatest Russian naval base, would be leased by Ukraine to Russia, and in much the same way that Cuba leases Guantanamo Bay to the United States. Of course, Cuba has tried to get back and tried to cancel the lease of Guantanamo Bay to the United States. It's been trying to get it back for years, but the Americans simply refuse. But you can see the delicate problem of what a lease means. And the Americans immediately saw, very obviously, that this would make Ukraine something of Russia's Achilles heel. The neocons watched the whole collapse of the Soviet Union as sharks might circle a shipwreck. In terms of NATO's expansion into the east, this was, of course, something which the Americans specifically promised Gorbachev would not happen when the Soviet Union withdrew its forces from Eastern Europe, allowed the reunification of the old enemy Germany, let go all the countries that wanted to claim independence, and basically retired to the minimal borders of Russia. The Americans agreed that they would not advance NATO up to the borders of Russia. They would not take control of all the territories that Russia liberated. Of course, this was a promise they broke like a twist of rotten thread, as Shakespeare would put it. And very soon they saw that the way they could bring down Russia was through Ukraine. The American neocons, once the Soviet Empire had fallen apart, began to see themselves as the new Roman Empire. They began to see that they represented civilization, and that civilization depended on the domination of the planet by one power only. It would become a unipolar world under American hegemony. And any power which was militarily able to resist America must be destroyed. This was the attitude of Rome, where Carthage, for example, had the military power to beat Rome, therefore Carthage must be destroyed. And the Americans saw Russia as a country to be destroyed because it had the power to threaten or to resist America militarily, and the only safe and peaceful world that the Americans could envisage from then on was a world which they dominated absolutely. And no other power must be allowed to exist that could resist American military power. The goal of the American neocons was therefore from the start to destroy Russia, to bankrupt it, and to make it too weak to support any longer the enormous nuclear arsenal that it had, so that they would be forced to gradually disband their military power as their financial and economic prosperity collapsed. So the goal immediately of the neocons was to exploit the internal opportunities that Ukraine provided through the fact that it was a divided society. As we've seen in many other countries, the fall of the Soviet Union led to an upsurge of nationalism. Every retreat of, shall we say, a supranational body leads to an upsurge in the sense of identity and the sense of nationalism of the individual countries. This was true also of Ukraine, which meant that whereas the Ukrainian-speaking nationalist population of the West and the Russian-speaking populations of the east of Ukraine had been in a sort of balance and got along with each other and not made too much of a fuss during the period of the Soviet Union, their hostility to each other became much more marked as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed. And the governments of Ukraine tended to oscillate between a government supported by the Western Ukrainian-speaking part of the population and a government supported by the Eastern Russian-speaking part of the population. There would be one election would go one way and one the other way. Now, these were simply, shall we say, local territorial rivalries, if you want, up until then. But once the neocons of America began to see their opportunities, they decided to intervene in this system in Ukraine and to realign the two sides of the country, the Ukrainian-speaking side and the Russian-speaking side, with a kind of ideological and geopolitical role. And they began to see that the Ukrainian nationalist western part of Ukraine was essentially forward-looking, progressive, democratic, open to Europe, wanting to join Europe, and that the eastern Russian-speaking part was backward, corrupt, almost mired in a kind of Soviet past, and wanting to stick to Russia as one sticks to, shall we say, an older model of society which has lost its validity, but which people cannot break themselves away from. In other words, they tried to ideologize what was basically a bit of friction between two linguistic communities in the country. And they intervened on several occasions in Ukrainian elections, notably when the government of Yanukovych was elected in 2004, I think it was, when the NGOs that, of course, flooded into the country once they could, began to claim that Yanukovych's Eastern-based government was corrupt and had cheated in the elections and had rigged the elections and so on, and they made the elections. They insisted the election should be rerun so that the Western-based party came to power instead. They did this once in 2005 in the so-called, what was it called? The Orange Revolution. And they were very astonished, of course, when this Western-based government proved just as corrupt and just as inept as the Eastern-based governments of Ukraine had proved. And the government of their heroes, as they thought, their anti-Russian heroes, fell at the next election, and Yanukovych was re-elected. But Yanukovych was not in any way fanatically anti-European by any means. I mean, far from it. The Russian-speaking part of Ukraine was equally interested in moving forward, diversifying its relationships with the rest of the world. And Yanukovych continued to negotiate with the European Union for an association, a trade partnership, which would be a kind of first step towards possible membership of the European Union at some future date. The problem was that the European Union, probably because they didn't like Yanukovych, they actually made an extremely mean offer to the Ukrainians, in which they offered virtually no access to the European market for all the goods that Ukraine really wanted to sell in Europe. And they offered less than 1 billion in, let's say, in funding and aid and the sort of money that the European Union has always given as a kind of bribe to people to get them to come into its web, so to speak. Yanukovych, quite rightly, looked at this miserable offer and said, well, I think I can get a better offer from the Russians. The Russians were at that stage trying to upgrade their own customs union and trade partnership with a number of their ex-Soviet states or neighbors, and they wanted Ukraine to join it, obviously, and they actually made a much better offer. Putin offered Ukraine $15 billion. So Yanukovych was a bit tempted. While he was hesitating, of course, the West Ukrainian parties accused him of turning his back on Europe and wanting to go back into the arms of Russia, which, was a typical kind of accusation thrown around in the ethnic and linguistic tensions of that time. And they managed to get all their protesters onto the streets to form sort of continuous demonstrations against Yanukovych, to try and bring down his government so that they could push ahead with the association agreement with the European Union. Even though Yanukovych had not actually closed the door on that agreement at all, he was still hesitating. Anyway, these riots and demonstrations became extremely violent. There were clashes in which people died, they were shot, but largely because the demonstrators themselves had become incredibly violent. They were spearheaded by neo-fascist groups, such as the Right Sector, which is one of these groups from Lviv in western Ukraine, in the western provinces, which were the fief of Stepan Bandera, and they themselves saw Stepan Bandera as their hero. In other words, they saw themselves as the direct descendants of the neo-Nazis that had sided with Hitler in the Second World War and carried out genocide against the Polish population of those provinces. So Yanukovych tried to negotiate with the opposition parties to calm down the situation, and they finally, on the 21st of February, reached an agreement in which Yanukovych would bring forward the elections. He would hold them within a year, and they would try and then resolve the problem peacefully. He also made some constitutional changes, or he promised to bring in laws to make constitutional changes to restore some of the aspects of the old constitution, which the opposition had been demanding should be restored. And no sooner was this agreement made than the Right Sector absolutely refused to accept it, and their demonstrators just continued a kind of violent attack on government buildings. So that very night, Yanukovych left Kiev and went to Kharkov, where he had some sort of convention planned with his own party of the regions, which it was his fief, Kharkov, and that's where the headquarters was of, let's say, the Russian-speaking parties. And while he was there, the parliament brought in measures to impeach him and sent out a warrant for his arrest. So instead of returning from Kharkov after this violent attack on the government buildings, Yanukovych fled to Russia. The new government was immediately denounced by the Russian-speaking regions as a government which was illegal, that had come to power by force, that it was a coup d'etat, and many of them refused to recognize it. The people of Crimea, as I said, began to launch protests saying, this is not our president. You can think of some of the protests going on in California and places today about not our president. This is exactly the way the people of Crimea reacted to what they saw as a coup d'etat in Kiev. This is not our president, particularly because the people coming to power were known to be fanatical nationalist Ukrainian speakers who hated Russia, hated the Russians, hated Russian speakers, and were determined to ban Russian as an official language of Ukraine, even though it is spoken by 40% of the people of Ukraine. So the people of Crimea were among those who began protesting against this new government in Kiev. And as we saw, the Russian troops in Sevastopol, the port of Crimea, moved into Crimea stealthily and simply took over the country, took over that province rather, simply by surrounding the Ukrainian military bases there and persuading their Ukrainian colleagues, because between military forces in an alliance, the relations were probably quite amicable. They simply persuaded the Ukrainian counterparts, look, we're not going to have a war between us. Why don't you just retire and go back to Ukraine? We'll let you go back there freely. It's not a problem, but we're taking over Crimea. And this peaceful transition then led the way to a referendum in which Crimean people, presumably relatively freely, voted to rejoin Russia. Now, of course, the vote has been very much criticized. I've heard young Ukrainians criticize it by saying, well, it certainly wasn't 96% of the vote or whatever it was. It couldn't have been that many. They criticize the numbers. And of course, we all know that in Soviet-style elections, the numbers are a fiction. But nobody seems to doubt that it was in Ukraine at the time, it was in Crimea at the time, that the people were, in their immense majority, enthusiastic about rejoining Russia, simply because they were afraid of the kind of government that had taken power in Kiev. This was a government dedicated to an anti-Russian program. And these were Russian speakers who didn't want to have their language abolished, who didn't want to have their children brought up speaking only Ukrainian and unable to read Pushkin or Tolstoy or the other parts of their cultural heritage that the Crimean people valued. So they rejected Ukraine, and in various other cities in the eastern part of Ukraine, the same sort of thing happened. In two of them, Donetsk and Lugansk, the movement succeeded. In others, Odessa and Kharkov, which were also largely Russian-speaking cities, the Ukrainian nationalists managed to crush any attempt to take control by the Russian-speaking militants. But in Donetsk and Lugansk, which were both in a mining district, a mining area called the Donbass, which is, I suppose it's the Yorkshire or the Wales of Ukraine. It's full of very tough mining people that have spent their lives in mines and steel factories and so on, and they don't like being pushed around. And these people took control, and they said, we're not going to recognize this government in Kiev. Curiously enough, the government, the people of Lviv, the militants of Lviv, the extreme nationalists, had done the same thing just a few days before to Yanukovych's government. They'd said, we're not going to recognize that. But of course, no military action was taken against them. But once the Donetsk and Lugansk militants took control of their cities, immediately the Ukrainian government began military action against them. They sent in their army, their tanks, their air force, as if they were fighting against some alien country instead of their own people. So that the Russian intervention, supposedly in Donbass, was very largely an intervention aimed to stop people like the Right Sector and the Azov Battalion, which are fascist militias, from marching into Donbass and murdering its population. And it's fairly clear that the presence of a certain number of Russian soldiers and probably a considerable amount of Russian armament and so on in that area is very carefully calibrated to defend the region against being overrun by the troops of Kiev, but without giving them sufficient firepower to actually gain territory themselves. Quite clearly, the Russians, with their military forces, if they wanted to, could push back the Ukrainian army all the way to Kiev, but they're not doing that. They're not giving the Donbass rebels sufficient arms or sufficient support in men and material to make any great advances. They're simply giving them enough to hold the line against the invasion coming from Kiev. And in that sense, you could see the actions of the Russians in giving a very limited amount of military help to the Donbass rebels as essentially defensive. When you think, for example, that the Western powers thought they had the right to intervene militarily to stop Gaddafi's troops from advancing on Benghazi and supposedly massacring the rebels of Benghazi, the West thought they had the right to intervene in Libya, of all countries. Why wouldn't the Russians think they had the right to intervene across their own border to defend Russian-speaking people against exactly the same kind of massacre at the hands of fanaticized Nazi troops coming at them from Kiev? Why wouldn't they have the same right to intervene in a very limited fashion to defend those who speak their language and who are descended from people who fought in the Red Army and defended them during the Second World War? Why wouldn't they have the right to defend them against attack by the nationalist fanatics of Kiev, many of whom, as I said, are disciples of Stepan Bandera, the Nazi who massacred 100,000 Poles during the Second World War? You've got to see that this propaganda that Russia has invaded the Donbass, that this is a problem of an invasion of Ukraine by Russia, is complete nonsense. This is a rebel, two rebellions, or a collective rebellion by the people of Donbass, centered on the two cities of Donetsk and Lugansk, trying to defend themselves against a vicious attack by the Kiev military forces, who would, if they got in there, massacre the population beyond any doubt. They're doing it on a daily basis already. The press keeps citing the figure of 10,000 deaths in the Ukrainian civil war already, as if somehow this is the fault of the rebels. But the rebels are just sitting in their own territory. They're not going anywhere. They're just sitting there being bombed and shelled by the Ukrainian army. It's the Ukrainian army and air force which is doing the killing. The rebels are simply defending their cities and their territory. And the Russians are giving them only enough armaments to do so, and not to advance any further. Not to advance any further. That much is clear, that the demand on the part of the Donbass rebels that they should be annexed by Russia is something that Vladimir Putin has told them from the start is not going to happen. They're not going to be part of Russia. If he wanted them to be part of Russia, he would have sent in divisions of the Russian army to make absolutely sure that their borders were secure and so on. But no, he has refused to annex those parts of of Ukraine, the Donbass. He's told them instead that they must settle for autonomy, which was the basis of the Minsk agreement. They must have an autonomous region in which they can govern themselves, and of course, in which they will no longer be subject to these language laws which have banned Russian from being an official language. It seems to me pretty extraordinary that Western media and Western journalists seem to have made absolutely no attempt to get into Donbass and tell the inside story of what is happening there from the point of view of those people. It seems to be pretty incredible that they're telling us the inside story of what's happening with the rebels of Aleppo, who are allied for the most part with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and yet they can't get into the Donbass and tell us the story of those people defending their territory against an advancing army which is determined to crush them and which calls them terrorists and refuses to negotiate with them. And that is, of course, the whole problem. The Minsk agreement allows for or calls for negotiations between the Donbass rebels and the Kiev government, and it is the Kiev government which absolutely refuses those negotiations, which refuses to even admit the existence of the Donbass rebel government structures, and keeps calling them terrorists and pretends that they're just the puppets of Putin. And the one-sided propaganda of the West against the Donbass rebellion is all the more extraordinary when you see what the Donbass people are having to put up with. There is a blockade against them. There has been a blockade for 2 years. Trucks carrying food are not allowed into the Donbass from other parts of Ukraine, even though the people of Kharkov and Odessa would want nothing better than to supply their Russian-speaking fellow citizens in Donbass with food. Those trucks are stopped at the border, the internal border, by the Azov battalion and the right sector fascist militias, and they're stopped from supplying Donbass with essential foodstuffs. There is a blockade of gas, of water, of electricity, and above all of banknotes. You can't get any notes out of your ATMs in Donbass because they've cut off the banking system, so that the Donbass is now totally dependent on Russia for its survival. It only gets food, water, gas, electricity, and even banknotes. Even pensions to the old are only supplied to the Donbass people by Russia because Ukraine has enforced a blockade. And it's that which is the essential madness of the Ukrainian position, because not only are they driving Donbass further and further into the arms of Russia as they basically become totally dependent on and symbiotic with the Russian economy because they can't survive without it, but they make it absolutely impossible for the Donbass rebels to even conceive giving up the border that they have with Russia to Ukrainian troops again, because they're afraid that those troops will simply enforce the blockade from that side as well, and that they will all starve to death. So the fact that the internal border between the Ukrainian forces and the Donbass has been sealed by the Ukrainians and a blockade has been enforced means that there's no way the Minsk agreement can ever be applied, can ever be enforced, because there's no way the rebels are going to give up control of their border with Russia, which is their only lifeline, their only supply line for food, medicine, everything they need to live comes from Russia at the moment. And the longer this impasse goes on, the longer this fascist government in Kiev refuses to talk to the rebels, the longer, shall we say, the further and more impossible the whole situation will go, until finally the idea of the Donbass people once again submitting to rule from Kiev will become utterly impossible. They will not do it because they have been treated like animals by the Kiev government. Their people have been bombed in their own streets, and there's no way they're going to accept that kind of rule again. So that the Western countries, which only see the solution as arming the Ukrainian government until it can crush the rebels, which is something ludicrous, because the moment those rebel lines move back, more Russian troops and tanks are going to come across the border to reinforce them. And the Western powers are basically trying to push for a total war between parts of Ukraine, which the Ukrainians themselves do not want. It's become a form of, almost a form of madness, in which the Ukrainian side is doing everything to make it impossible to resolve the situation. The Donbass rebels ask for nothing more than to sit down with the Kiev government and discuss what are the constitutional arrangements going to be between us. It is the Kiev government that refuses to do so. And the kind of bias of the Western press, which has portrayed all this as a Russian invasion of Ukraine, when it is a Russian protection of a rebellion against forces that would crush it in the most brutal way imaginable if they could, because they've already killed 10,000 of them. Why wouldn't they kill 1 million of them? The caricaturing of what is happening by the Western press it reached a high point during the terrible, terrible accident of the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner MH17. And there we had a situation where very probably the Ukrainians have always, the people of Donbass have always denied it, very probably a rebel anti-aircraft missile system was used to try and shoot down some of the planes that were bombing Donetsk and Lugansk. And accidentally, they shot down an airliner. And this airliner, of course, had no right to be over a war zone. It's absolutely incredible and totally immoral on the part of the Kiev government not to have closed the airspace over the war zone of eastern Ukraine. Because even 2 days before that plane was shot down, fighter bombers from the Kiev Air Force had been shot down by the rebel forces. So they clearly had the means to bring down planes. They were bringing them down, and yet the Kiev government did not close that airspace to civilian airliners. You can only conclude that they were hoping that a tragedy like this would happen so that they could use it for propaganda purposes against the rebels. And that is, of course, what happened. The Western press just treated this as the greatest war crime of the century. A people who are desperately trying to defend themselves against fighter bombers from their own air force coming over and bombing their streets, and were using every means that they could get hold of to try and shoot those planes down, accidentally shot down an airliner. Why in God's name would they have done it deliberately? Who in their right mind would shoot down an airliner deliberately and bring upon them the whole condemnation of the world when they were desperately trying to get recognition as a victim people being attacked by their own government? And yet there was not even a single article in Western media of any description that I ever read which even put forward for 1 second the idea that this might have been a tragic accident. Even when footage appeared on the internet of the rebel forces, rebel soldiers, discovering the wreckage and walking in through the wreckage, and you could hear them saying over and over, civilians, civilians, in voices that were shocked and horrified. And then they said, who gave them the authorization to fly over this route? And you know what the captions were to that kind of footage on the internet, which was broadcast, which was in part of the some of the major media outlets of the Western world? The captions they used for that were, here are the rebels engaging in a sickening desecration of the dead and gloating over their victims. That was how it was treated. Now that kind of lie, that kind of vicious hatred of a people can only be put forward deliberately for one reason and for one reason only, in order to prepare the world for war. And that is what I accuse the Western mass media of doing. They are trying to soften up the population for a war with Russia. Every single week you get the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, Newsweek coming out with another headline basically calling for war with Russia. And I hope that when that war does come, and humanity is in large part wiped out, that some of that media garbage will survive, so that the remnants of humanity that look back on this catastrophe will be able to see who was responsible for it. And it was 100% the Western media and Western politicians that will be responsible for the Third World War, which they are deliberately planning because they are out of their minds. They have totally lost their sense of reality. They seriously believe this garbage that the Americans can defend themselves with their missile shields against 7,000 nuclear warheads. They will be wiped out. Humanity is on the brink of extinction. And these mass media scum are responsible. I think that there are times in history where language almost fails us to describe the stupidity and the evil of human beings. And that stupidity and evil is among us today to a degree we haven't seen for half a century. And I really do believe that unless Western populations get a hold of themselves, unless they call their governments and their media to account to stop this war hysteria, this war fever, which the Russians can see happening and which they are beginning to mirror in their own mass media as well, if this goes on, we will have a nuclear war. There will be 7,000 nuclear warheads, some of them powerful enough, some of them 100 times more powerful than Hiroshima, and they will be raining down on Western cities. And you will be responsible because you have been part of this hysterical campaign of hatred of Russia. And why has this hysterical campaign been unleashed? Simply because the neocons were furious that the Russians outwitted them by getting hold of Sevastopol and re-annexing it, when they had planned their great plan to destroy Russia by getting the Ukrainians to cancel the lease on Sevastopol, to hand it over to the American Navy, so that the Sixth Fleet could patrol up and down the coasts of Russia and have their nuclear warheads at 5 minutes traveling time from Russian cities. That's what the neocons were planning. That's what Putin outwitted them in his annexation of Crimea without a shot fired, in his annexation of Sevastopol without a shot fired. That is why they've unleashed this hysterical war fever against Russia. Because they lost. Because they lost their great game. They thought they could destroy Russia by discrediting Putin. They thought they could destroy Russia by humiliating it totally, by forcing it to accept the loss of Sevastopol, its sacred city, the city which has survived 2 great sieges and still come back and become a hero city in the eyes of the Russian people. This entire evil warmongering campaign is a kind of revenge by the neocons for being outplayed. And they are going to up the stakes. And they're going to keep upping the stakes until the war takes place. And you are responsible for this as well. Because you tolerate this propaganda. You tolerate this war hysteria. You don't denounce it. This is probably the only serious issue of our time. Global warming will not have time to happen. We will be warmed in another way by thermonuclear explosions. And it will happen because of the state of our mass media and our evil, lying politicians. That's all I have to say to you.